You could offer double pay, and I still would not serve that man. The whisper traveled across the restaurant only seconds before the front doors opened. Conversations softened. Servers exchanged nervous glances. Even the manager straightened his tie. Harrison Blake had arrived. At 41 years old, Harrison was one of the most successful billionaires in New York. He owned companies worth billions of dollars, appeared regularly on financial television, and had a reputation that followed him into every restaurant, hotel, and private club in the city. Unfortunately, that reputation was not always a pleasant one. Harrison was known for impossible standards. Meals were returned. Tables were changed. Tiny details became major complaints. Nobody knew whether he was genuinely difficult or simply expected perfection from everyone around him. Either way, restaurant staff dreaded seeing his name on a reservation list. Tonight was no different. As Harrison walked through the dining room wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, several employees immediately looked away. A young waiter quietly asked another server to trade tables. The answer was an immediate no. Near the hostess stand, the manager was already trying to decide who would take responsibility for serving him. That was when Emily Carter stepped out of the employee hallway carrying a tray of polished glasses. 28 years old. Blonde hair tied neatly back. White skin lightly touched by the warm glow of the restaurant lights. Calm eyes. Calm posture. Calm presence. She had only worked at the restaurant for 6 weeks. Long enough to learn the menu. Not long enough to learn every local legend. Emily, the manager called. Table 12 is yours tonight. Emily glanced across the room. The gentleman by the window? The manager hesitated. Yes. A few nearby servers exchanged looks of sympathy. One of them actually winced. Emily noticed the reactions immediately. Should I be worried? She asked. Nobody answered right away. Finally, another waitress leaned closer. That is Harrison Blake. Emily waited. Okay. The waitress blinked. That is all. Emily smiled politely. Should there be more? Several. Employees stared at her. Apparently, she had missed the memo. Harrison Blake was supposed to make people nervous. Emily simply picked up a menu and headed toward table 12. Across the room, Harrison sat alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The city sparkled beyond the glass like a sea of lights. His attention remained fixed on his phone as he reviewed financial reports. He barely looked up when Emily approached. Good evening, Mr. Blake, she said warmly. Welcome back. Harrison lowered the phone slowly. Most servers greeted him carefully. Some sounded nervous. Others sounded rehearsed. Emily sounded neither. Good evening, he replied. Would you like a few minutes with the menu? Emily asked. Harrison closed the menu without opening it. No. Emily nodded. Then what may I bring you? Harrison studied her for a moment. There was something unusual about her composure. Most people recognized him immediately. Most adjusted their behavior. She seemed completely unaffected. What would you recommend? He asked. Emily answered without hesitation. The herb-crusted salmon is excellent tonight. Harrison raised an eyebrow. Excellent. Yes. Not good. Emily smiled. Good is on the menu every night. Excellent depends on the chef. Tonight happens to be excellent. For the first time, a faint expression of amusement crossed Harrison's face. It disappeared almost instantly. Interesting answer. Emily simply waited. Harrison decided to test her. It was a habit he had developed over the years. Sometimes curiosity, sometimes boredom, sometimes both. What if I dislike salmon? He asked. Then I would not recommend ordering it. Emily's tone remained perfectly polite. A nearby server nearly dropped a tray after overhearing the exchange. Harrison looked up again, this time longer than before. He was expecting nervousness. He was expecting uncertainty. Instead, he found confidence without arrogance. It was unexpected. Fine, he said. Bring the salmon. Emily wrote down the order. Excellent choice. Harrison almost laughed at the irony. As she turned to leave, he watched her walk away. Around the restaurant, several employees waited for signs of trouble, complaints, demands, frustration. Instead, nothing happened. The first test had produced a result Harrison did not expect. For reasons he could not explain, that made him curious enough to start planning the second one. Emily delivered the salmon 12 minutes later. The presentation was flawless. Fresh herbs, perfect color, steam rising gently beneath the warm restaurant lights. She placed the plate in front of Harrison and stepped back. Please let me know if there is anything else you need. Harrison looked at the dish, but did not immediately reach for his fork. Instead, he studied Emily. She remained completely composed. No nervous shifting. No forced smile. No sign that she was standing in front of the man every employee seemed determined to avoid. Actually, Harrison said, there is something. Around the room, a few staff members quietly noticed the exchange. Emily nodded. Of course. Harrison glanced toward the large window overlooking Manhattan. This table is too close to the glass. Emily followed his gaze. The skyline stretched across the horizon in a breathtaking display of lights. Most guests specifically requested this table because of the view. Would you prefer another table? She asked. Possibly. Emily looked around the dining room. Every premium table was occupied. A less experienced server might have panicked. Instead, she simply considered the situation. What exactly is bothering you about the location? Harrison was not expecting that question. Usually people rushed to solve the complaint before understanding it. The reflections, he replied. I cannot see the city clearly. Emily glanced at the glass again, then at the lighting above the table. A few seconds later she smiled. You are right. Harrison raised an eyebrow. I am. The problem is not the table. Harrison leaned back slightly. Then what is it? Emily pointed discreetly toward a decorative pendant light hanging nearby. The angle of that fixture creates a reflection directly where you are looking. Harrison turned toward the glass. For the first time he noticed it. A faint reflection cutting across part of the skyline. Emily continued. If you move 18 inches to the left side of the table, the reflection disappears. Harrison looked skeptical but shifted his chair slightly. Instantly the view changed. The reflection vanished. Manhattan appeared crystal clear beyond the glass. For a moment he simply stared. Then he looked back at Emily. You figured that out in 10 seconds? Emily shrugged lightly. I have served this table many times. Harrison found himself smiling despite his efforts not to. Interesting. Emily nodded politely and walked away. Several employees exchanged confused looks. Another test had failed. Harrison expected frustration. He expected discomfort. Instead, she solved the problem before it could become one. Meanwhile, Emily returned to her other tables. To her, the interaction was unremarkable. Customers had preferences. Her job was to help. Nothing more. Yet across the dining room, Harrison found his attention drifting toward her repeatedly. The strange thing was not her intelligence. It was her ability to remain completely unaffected by his reputation. Most people arrive carrying assumptions about who he was. Emily seemed interested only in who he was at that moment. 20 minutes later, she returned to check on the meal. How is the salmon? Harrison set down his fork. Excellent. Emily smiled. I told you. The answer caught him off guard. There was no arrogance in her voice. Only quiet confidence. Harrison laughed softly. Nearby employees stared in disbelief. Seeing Harrison Blake laugh during dinner was unusual enough. Seeing him enjoy himself was almost unheard of. Emily noticed none of it. Would you like dessert tonight? She asked. Harrison glanced at the menu, then closed it. Another idea had formed in his mind. Another test. Slightly more difficult this time. Tell me something, he said. Emily waited. If you could have any career in the world, what would it be? It was an odd question. Personal. Unexpected. Most servers would have answered immediately or politely avoided it. Emily did neither. She considered the question carefully. Then she looked directly at him. The best career is the one that allows you to sleep peacefully at night. Harrison blinked once. The answer was so unexpected that he forgot to respond. Emily simply waited. Across the room, the noise of the restaurant continued. Glasses clinked. Conversations flowed. But for Harrison, everything seemed quieter. Because for the second time that evening, a waitress had given him an answer he could not stop thinking about. Harrison remained seated long after Emily walked away. Her answer should not have mattered. It was a simple sentence from a waitress in a restaurant. Yet somehow it lingered in his mind more stubbornly than the financial reports waiting on his phone. The best career is the one that allows you to sleep peacefully at night. He glanced around the dining room. Business executives filled several tables. Deals were being discussed. Numbers were being negotiated. Ambition hung in the air as heavily as the scent of expensive coffee and grilled steak. Most of the people in the room would define success through income, status, or influence. Emily had not mentioned any of those things. That bothered him more than he cared to admit. Across the restaurant, several employees were now quietly watching the situation unfold. Not openly. Just enough to notice that Harrison Blake had not complained once. One waiter leaned toward another. How is she doing that? The second waiter shook his head. I have no idea. Even the manager seemed confused. He had expected at least one problem by now. Instead, the evening was moving more smoothly than any previous visit Harrison had made to the restaurant. A few minutes later, Emily returned carrying a tray with coffee service for another table. Harrison noticed something unusual. She greeted every customer exactly the same way. Families, tourists, business executives, elderly couples. It did not matter who they were. Her level of attention never changed. There was something quietly remarkable about that consistency. Most people adjusted themselves depending on who sat across from them. Emily seemed interested only in doing her job well. When she finally returned to his table again, Harrison decided to continue the conversation. Can I ask another question? Emily smiled politely. You seem determined to. Harrison laughed softly. Maybe. Emily folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. All right. Harrison studied her for a moment. Why do you work here? Emily looked genuinely surprised. Because they hired me. That is not what I mean. She waited. Harrison continued. You seem too observant to spend your life carrying plates. For the first time that evening, Emily became quiet. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. She glanced briefly toward the window before answering. People make assumptions based on uniforms. Harrison raised an eyebrow. And are they wrong? Emily smiled faintly. Usually. Harrison leaned back. That sounds like experience talking. It is. The answer created more questions than it resolved. Harrison could feel it. There was a story hidden beneath those words. Yet Emily offered nothing more. She seemed perfectly comfortable leaving a mystery unsolved. What did you study? Harrison asked. Emily looked at him carefully. You assume I studied something? I assume a lot of things, Harrison admitted. That earned another small smile. At least you were honest about it. Harrison noticed something then. She never answered questions she did not want to answer. Not rudely. Not defensively. She simply redirected the conversation with remarkable skill. It was almost impressive. Across the room, a group of executives entered the restaurant. Several immediately recognized Harrison and waved. He acknowledged them politely before returning his attention to Emily. Do you know who I am? He asked suddenly. Emily nodded. Of course. Harrison looked surprised. You do? The staff talks. And that does not make you nervous? Emily thought about the question for a second. Then she shook her head. Should it? Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the third time that evening, he found himself without an answer. Emily continued before he could respond. People are people, Mr. Blake. Her voice remained calm. Some have more money. Some have less. Some have bigger offices. Some have smaller apartments. But everyone still wants respect. Everyone still worries about something. Everyone still hopes tomorrow will be better than today. Harrison stared at her. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into the background once again. There was no lecture in her voice. No attempt to impress him. She spoke as if stating an obvious truth. Then Emily glanced toward another table where a family was trying to get her attention. I should help them. Harrison nodded slowly. Of course. As she walked away, he watched her disappear into the crowd of customers. For the first time in years, Harrison Blake realized he was no longer testing the waitress. The uncomfortable truth was that somewhere along the way, she had started testing him. For the next 30 minutes, something unusual happened inside the restaurant. People stopped paying attention to their own conversations and started paying attention to table 12. Not openly. Not enough to seem rude. Just enough to notice that Harrison Blake was behaving differently than anyone had seen before. The kitchen staff noticed it first. Normally, at least one dish would be returned before the evening ended. Tonight, nothing came back. Then the manager noticed that Harrison had not asked for a table change, a replacement meal, or a special request. Even the regular customers who recognized him seemed surprised by how calm the evening felt. Yet the biggest surprise was that Emily appeared completely unaware of the attention. She moved through the dining room exactly as she had when her shift began. She refilled water glasses, checked on families, helped elderly guests with their coats, took dessert orders. To her, Harrison was simply another customer. That fact fascinated him more with every passing minute. Eventually, Emily returned carrying a cup of coffee. Compliments of the house, she said. Harrison looked at the cup. Why? Emily placed it gently on the table. Because our manager thinks this has been the smoothest visit you have ever had here. Harrison almost laughed. Is that what people are saying? Emily glanced around the room. More or less. Harrison shook his head. I had no idea my reputation was that bad. Emily considered that statement carefully. People tend to remember difficult experiences more than pleasant ones. Harrison nodded slowly. That sounds like another life lesson. Maybe. She smiled. Or maybe it is just human nature. Before she could leave, Harrison noticed a leather notebook partially visible inside her apron pocket. It looked worn from years of use. What is that? He asked. Emily glanced down. A notebook. I can see that. For the first time, she looked slightly amused. Then I guess my answer was accurate. Harrison smiled despite himself. Do you always answer questions like that? Only when the question is obvious. Harrison pointed toward the notebook. What do you write in it? Emily hesitated. Then she removed it from her pocket. The cover showed years of wear. Corners softened by time. Pages filled with handwritten notes. Ideas, she said. Harrison looked surprised. What kind of ideas? Emily opened the notebook briefly. The pages contained observations, quotes, sketches of plans, and short reflections about people she had met. Nothing dramatic. Nothing secret. Just careful observations. Harrison turned a page. Then another. The handwriting was precise. Organized. Thoughtful. One sentence caught his attention immediately. He read it twice. The way people treat someone with nothing to offer reveals more than the way they treat someone powerful. Harrison slowly closed the notebook. The words hit harder than he expected. Emily accepted it back without comment. Across the room, several customers began preparing to leave. The dinner rush was fading. Soft jazz drifted through the speakers overhead. Outside the windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a blanket of city lights. Harrison found himself staring at the skyline for several seconds. Then he looked back at Emily. You write all of those? She nodded. Most of them. Why? Emily thought about the question. Because people are interesting. Harrison laughed softly. That's simple. Usually. Then her expression became slightly more thoughtful. Most people spend their lives trying to be understood. Very few spend time trying to understand others. Harrison fell silent. Once again, she had managed to answer a simple question in a way that stayed with him. Across the restaurant, employees continued watching from a distance. None of them knew exactly what was happening. They only knew that the billionaire who usually made everyone uncomfortable was sitting quietly, listening to a waitress. And for perhaps the first time in a very long time, Harrison Blake realized he was learning far more from the conversation than he was contributing to it. As the evening moved closer to closing time, Harrison realized something he had not expected when he first walked through the restaurant doors. He no longer cared about testing Emily. Somewhere between the salmon, the coffee, and the quiet observations from her notebook, the game had disappeared. In its place was a growing curiosity that refused to leave him alone. Emily, meanwhile, continued moving through the dining room with the same calm rhythm she had shown all night. She cleared tables, collected menus, thanked guests for coming. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had become the center of attention. Yet Harrison could feel that something had changed. Not only for him, for everyone. Near the service station, employees still glanced occasionally toward table 12. They expected some dramatic moment. A complaint. A disagreement. A sudden change in mood. Instead, they found something much stranger. Respect. Harrison finished his coffee and watched Emily help an elderly couple prepare to leave. Before the man stood up, she quietly moved his cane closer so he would not have to reach for it. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. Most people never noticed it. Harrison did. A few minutes later, she brought a takeout container to a mother whose young son had fallen asleep at the table before finishing his meal. Again, she did it without being asked. Again, nobody seemed to notice. Except Harrison. The more he watched, the more he realized Emily possessed an unusual talent. She paid attention. Not the superficial kind of attention most people offered. Real attention. The kind that noticed details before they became problems. The kind that made people feel seen. Eventually, Emily returned to collect his empty coffee cup. Would you like another? She asked. Harrison shook his head. No, thank you. Emily nodded and reached for the cup. Then Harrison asked, Can I tell you something? She paused. Of course. Harrison glanced toward the window before speaking. When I first arrived tonight, I expected this evening to go very differently. Emily smiled faintly. Good differently or bad differently? Honestly. Harrison laughed softly. Probably bad. Emily did not appear offended. That is fair. You are not surprised? Not really. Harrison leaned back. Why not? Emily placed the cup onto her tray. Because people usually expect what they have experienced before. Harrison considered that. And what if previous experiences were accurate? Emily tilted her head slightly. Then maybe they were accurate for that moment. Harrison looked at her carefully. That sounds like another notebook quote. Emily laughed for the first time all evening. A genuine laugh. Warm and effortless. Several nearby employees immediately looked over, surprised by the sound. Maybe it is, she admitted. Harrison smiled. Then his expression became more thoughtful. You noticed something about me tonight. Emily remained silent. I can tell. She studied him for a second before answering. Everyone notices things. Not like you do. For the first time, Emily hesitated. Not because she was uncomfortable. Because she was deciding how honest to be. Finally, she said, you spend a lot of time looking at your phone even when nothing is happening on it. Harrison blinked. What? You check it constantly. Most people do. Emily nodded. That is true. Then why mention it? Emily glanced toward the dark city skyline beyond the glass. Because most people do it when they are bored. You do it when you are thinking. Harrison stared at her. She continued calmly. You also look at the window every time a conversation becomes personal. The tray suddenly felt much heavier in her hands than it actually was. Not because of the weight. Because of the silence that followed. Harrison slowly looked toward the window. Then back at Emily. The observation was completely accurate. Uncomfortably accurate. How did you figure that out? He asked quietly. Emily smiled. I told you earlier. People are interesting. Then she turned and walked away. Harrison remained seated, watching her disappear toward the kitchen doors. For the first time that night, he was not wondering who Emily Carter used to be. He was wondering how someone everyone overlooked had managed to understand him better than people who had known him for years. The restaurant finally began to empty. One by one, the remaining guests settled their bills and disappeared into the Manhattan night. The soft music remained. The city lights still glowed beyond the glass. But the energy of the room had changed. The rush was over. What remained was quiet. Harrison checked the time and realized he had been sitting there far longer than usual. Normally, he finished dinner and left. Tonight he stayed. Not because of the food. Not because of the view. Because every conversation with Emily seemed to raise a new question. Near the service station, the manager approached Emily while she organized receipts. You know he has been here almost 3 hours, he whispered. Emily glanced toward table 12. Has he? Emily. The manager lowered his voice further. Do you understand who that is? Emily smiled. A customer. The manager shook his head and walked away, unable to decide whether she was joking. Across the room, Harrison noticed the exchange. A few minutes later, Emily returned to clear the final plate from his table. Long night? She asked. Harrison looked at her. Maybe. Emily nodded. You look tired. The observation caught him off guard. Most people told him he looked successful, important, powerful. Very few ever told him he looked tired. Do I? Emily set the plate on her tray. A little. Harrison stared at her. You really do notice everything. Emily laughed softly. Not everything. Enough. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Harrison made a decision. Sit down for a minute. Emily looked surprised. I am working. 1 minute. She hesitated before glancing around the nearly empty dining room. Finally, she pulled out the chair across from him. 1 minute. Harrison nodded. For the first time all evening, there were no menus, plates, or coffee cups between them. Just conversation. Harrison folded his hands. Can I ask you something personal? Emily considered the question. You can ask. Will you answer? That depends on the question. Harrison smiled. Fair enough. He paused. Why do I get the feeling this is not where you expected to be in life? Emily became very still. Not defensive. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. The question seemed to travel somewhere far away before she finally answered. Because it is not. Harrison watched her carefully. Then why are you here? Emily looked toward the city lights beyond the glass. Life changed. The answer was simple. Yet something about it carried weight. Harrison could feel it. That sounds like a very short version. Emily smiled faintly. It is. Harrison waited. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar deals. He understood the value of silence. Sometimes people revealed more when given room to think. Finally, Emily spoke again. A few years ago, I had different plans. What kind of plans? She looked down briefly before answering. School, career, a different future. Harrison nodded slowly. What happened? Emily remained quiet for several seconds. Then she smiled in a way that carried both sadness and peace at the same time. Family happened. The words landed gently. Yet they explained more than an entire speech could have. Harrison suddenly understood why she never talked about ambition, why she seemed immune to status, why she valued people more than titles. Somewhere along the way, she had been forced to choose what mattered most. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Emily looked surprised by the question. She thought about it carefully before answering. Some days are harder than others. Harrison listened. But no. She shook her head. I do not regret helping the people I love. The restaurant seemed completely silent. Even the music felt distant. Harrison found himself looking away toward the window. Not because he wanted to, because he needed a moment to think. Emily noticed immediately. There it is again, she said softly. Harrison turned back. What? Emily smiled. The window. Harrison laughed. You really are impossible. Maybe. Then she stood from the chair and lifted the tray. My 1 minute is over. Harrison watched her begin walking away. Then he asked one final question. Emily. She turned. Yes. Harrison looked at her for a long moment. I think there is a lot more to your story. Emily smiled gently, not confirming, not denying. Good night, Mr. Blake. Then she disappeared through the kitchen doors, leaving Harrison alone with a growing realization. The woman everyone assumed was ordinary might be the most remarkable person he had met in years. Harrison left the restaurant that night with more questions than answers. The city was quiet as his car moved through the streets of Manhattan, but his thoughts refused to settle. He had met brilliant people before. Investors, entrepreneurs, professors, industry leaders. Yet none of them lingered in his mind the way Emily Carter did. Perhaps it was because she never tried to impress him. Perhaps it was because she seemed completely uninterested in proving anything. Whatever the reason, he could not stop thinking about the conversation. The next morning, Harrison arrived at his office earlier than usual. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the room with pale sunlight. Financial reports covered his desk. Assistants moved through the executive floor preparing for another busy day. Yet before reviewing a single document, Harrison pressed a button on his desk phone. Laura, he said when his assistant answered. I need some information. Of course. Nothing private. Nothing inappropriate. Just public information. Laura paused. About what? Harrison looked toward the skyline. Someone I met. 2 hours later, a folder arrived on his desk. Harrison opened it without hesitation. The first page contained basic information. Emily Carter, 28 years old, New York resident. Current employment at the restaurant. Nothing unusual. Then he turned the page. His expression changed immediately. Academic honors. Scholarship awards. Exceptional university performance. Multiple recognitions for analytical achievement. Harrison read the section twice. Then a third time. The records did not match the life Emily appeared to be living. According to the information in front of him, she had once been on a path toward an extraordinarily successful career. Yet somehow she had ended up serving tables. Harrison continued reading. The answer appeared several pages later. Family medical hardship. Educational interruption. Long-term caregiving responsibilities. He slowly leaned back in his chair. The pieces began fitting together. The calmness. The maturity. The complete lack of obsession with status. Emily had faced decisions that forced her to see life differently. While others chased titles, she had been carrying responsibilities that most people never imagined. Harrison stared at the file for several minutes. Not out of pity, out of respect. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily's day looked very different. She sat beside a hospital window holding a paper cup of coffee. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh flowers. Across from her sat her younger brother, Ryan. He looked healthier than he had in years. Stronger, more energetic. Recovery had been slow, but it was finally happening. Ryan noticed Emily staring out the window. You are thinking again. Emily smiled. That is usually how thinking works. Ryan laughed. Something happened. Emily raised an eyebrow. Why does everyone keep saying that? Because I know you. He pointed toward the untouched coffee in her hands. You only forget to drink it when your mind is somewhere else. Emily looked down at the cup and laughed softly. Maybe I met an interesting customer. Ryan immediately smiled. Interesting how? Emily considered the question. Different. Good different. Emily thought about Harrison. The questions. The curiosity. The surprising willingness to listen. Maybe. Ryan nodded knowingly. That means yes. Emily shook her head, but did not argue. Back in his office, Harrison closed the folder and stared out at the city. The realization settled slowly. All evening he had assumed Emily was hiding talent. The truth was much bigger. She was not hiding it at all. She simply was not using it to define herself. That distinction changed everything. Most people built their identity around achievements. Emily seemed to build hers around values. And for the first time since meeting her, Harrison understood why. None of his tests had worked. They had failed because Emily Carter was never trying to win. She already knew who she was. 3 days later, Harrison returned to the restaurant. He told himself the visit was accidental. Convenient. A coincidence between meetings. The explanation sounded reasonable until he realized he had driven 20 minutes out of his way to get there. As soon as he stepped inside, several employees recognized him. The manager straightened immediately. A few servers exchanged knowing glances. Only Emily reacted normally. She was carrying a tray of water glasses when she spotted him near the entrance. "Good evening, Mr. Blake," she said. "Good evening, Emily." The familiarity of the exchange surprised both of them. Harrison was shown to the same table near the window. The city shimmered beneath the evening sky. For a few moments, he simply watched the restaurant move around him. Families celebrated birthdays. Couples shared quiet conversations. Friends laughed over dinner. Meanwhile, Emily moved through the room with the same calm confidence he remembered. Nothing about her had changed. And somehow that impressed him even more. When she approached to take his order, Harrison closed the menu. "Let me guess," he said. Emily smiled. "The salmon is excellent tonight." Harrison laughed. "You remembered." "I remember most things." The answer carried an unexpected meaning now. Harrison had spent the last few days thinking about everything he had learned. The academic achievements. The scholarships. The opportunities she had stepped away from. Yet standing here, Emily looked exactly the same as before. No bitterness. No regret. No desire for recognition. "Can I ask you something?" Harrison said. Emily tilted her head slightly. "Another question?" "Just one." "That is what you said last time." Harrison smiled. "Fair point." Emily folded her hands lightly. "Go ahead." Harrison looked directly at her. "Do you ever think about going back?" For the first time, Emily immediately understood what he meant. School. The career she had left behind. The future that once seemed certain. She glanced toward the window before answering. "Sometimes." Harrison waited. And Emily took a slow breath. Life does not always pause while you make plans. That is not really an answer. It is the honest one. Harrison nodded. He appreciated honesty, even when it came wrapped in ambiguity. A few minutes later, after she delivered his meal, he noticed something happening near the entrance. A young server accidentally dropped a stack of menus. They scattered across the floor. The server looked embarrassed. Before anyone else reacted, Emily quietly walked over, helped gather them, said something encouraging, and returned to work. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Harrison noticed the young employee immediately relax. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but it revealed something important. Emily had a habit of making difficult situations easier for other people. Not because she had to, because she chose to. Later that evening, Harrison finished dinner and remained seated while Emily cleared the table. Then he reached into his jacket and removed a business card. Emily looked down at it. "What is this?" Harrison placed it gently on the table. "My direct number." Emily looked surprised. "Why?" Harrison considered the question carefully. "Because I think you are one of the smartest people I have met in a long time." Emily immediately shook her head. "That is generous." "It is true." She looked away for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the compliment. Harrison noticed that too. Most people chased praise. Emily seemed determined to avoid it. "I am serious," he continued. "If you ever decide you want to talk about opportunities, call me." Emily looked at the card but did not pick it up right away. The restaurant lights reflected softly across the table between them. Finally, she smiled. Not because of the offer, because of what it represented. Respect. Genuine respect. "Thank you," she said quietly. Harrison nodded. "You earned it." Neither spoke for a moment. Then Emily slipped the card into her apron pocket. Across the room, several employees had witnessed the exchange. None of them could believe what they were seeing. The man everyone feared had just offered something he rarely gave anyone: his trust. As Harrison prepared to leave, Emily walked him toward the door. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Before stepping onto the sidewalk, Harrison turned back toward her. "You know," he said, "I came here expecting to teach people a lesson about standards." Emily smiled, and Harrison looked at her for a long moment. "I think I learned one instead." Several weeks passed. Summer settled over New York, bringing longer evenings and golden light that lingered across the city skyline. Life continued moving forward for everyone, yet something subtle had changed. Harrison no longer visited the restaurant because of curiosity. He visited because it had become one of the few places where nobody expected anything from him except honesty. On a warm Thursday evening, he stepped through the doors and immediately noticed the atmosphere felt different. Employees were smiling more than usual. A small celebration seemed to be taking place near the service station. Emily was standing with several co-workers who appeared unusually excited. When she spotted Harrison entering, she smiled and walked over. "Good evening, Mr. Blake." "Good evening, Emily." Harrison glanced toward the gathering. "Did I miss something?" Emily hesitated before answering. "Maybe." One of the servers nearby laughed. "Tell him." Emily shook her head. "You tell him." The young server looked delighted by the opportunity. "Emily is going back to school." Harrison blinked. For a moment he simply stared. Then he looked at Emily. "You are?" She nodded. "Part-time at first." A smile slowly appeared across Harrison's face. It was not the smile of a businessman hearing good news. It was the smile of someone witnessing a door reopen after years of being closed. "Congratulations." Emily looked genuinely touched. "Thank you." Harrison glanced around the room. The excitement suddenly made sense. Everyone here knew her story, at least pieces of it. They knew what she had given up. They knew what she had carried. This moment belonged to all of them. Later that evening, after the dinner rush slowed, Emily joined Harrison near the window. The city glowed beyond the glass exactly as it had on the night they first met. Yet everything felt different now. "You never called," Harrison said with a faint smile. Emily laughed softly. "About the business card?" Harrison nodded. "Most people would have. That is probably why I did not." Harrison shook his head. "You know, that answer sounds exactly like something you would say." They both laughed. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Emily reached into her apron pocket. Harrison immediately recognized the business card. It was slightly worn around the edges now. She placed it gently on the table. "I carried it every day." Harrison looked surprised. "Why?" Emily glanced toward the skyline. "Because it reminded me of something." "What?" Emily smiled. "That somebody saw more in me than my uniform." The words settled quietly between them. Harrison looked down at the card for a moment before responding. "The truth is that everyone else could have seen it too." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Maybe." Harrison shook his head. "No, definitely." Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Cars moved through the streets below. Office buildings reflected the colors of the evening sky. Inside the restaurant, conversations drifted softly through the air. Ordinary moments. Ordinary people. Yet somehow the moment felt important. Harrison looked around the room. Weeks earlier, this restaurant had been a place he entered expecting perfection from everyone around him. Now it had become the place where he learned something far more valuable. He learned that wisdom does not announce itself. Character does not demand attention. And extraordinary people rarely look the way the world expects them to look. Emily stood as another table requested assistance. Before leaving, she paused beside the window. "You know something?" Harrison looked up. "What?" Emily smiled. "You became much easier to serve." Harrison laughed so hard that several nearby customers turned to look. Emily laughed too before walking away. He watched her move through the restaurant one last time. Calm, confident, unchanged by praise, unchanged by recognition. Exactly the same person she had been on the night they met. And that was precisely why she stood out. Harrison looked toward the city beyond the glass and smiled. Sometimes the people who leave the deepest impact are not the ones with the loudest voices, the biggest titles, or the most impressive resumes. Sometimes they are simply the ones who remind us who we could be if we stopped measuring worth by status and started measuring it by character.